Well, it's my honor to be here. I would like to begin by thanking Oportunidad and especially Andronica Luksic for this opportunity, as well as the Ministry of Education for partnering with the Oportunidad in order to bring this seminar here this morning. I wish I could speak Spanish, so I hope you will all bear with me through the translation. Fortunately, the PowerPoint is in Spanish, and that means all of you can understand the PowerPoint, but not me so much. So hopefully somehow we will be able to communicate. The title of my talk is Why We Should Invest in Young Children. And this is a new talk for me. I put it together in order to crystallize some of my thoughts about the importance of early childhood education, both from a developmental perspective and from an economic perspective. So I'm going to be talking about some of my work as well as work of various colleagues. So I want to begin by maybe stating something that's pretty obvious, and that is that early childhood education supports two national priorities of developing and industrialized nations. First, it helps families work, especially when you have cultures where both mothers and fathers work. But second, and I think more important, especially in the context today, early childhood education ensures that children enter formal schooling ready to succeed. And this is a very important point. Now, when we talk about early childhood education, I think it's very important to talk about the culture and the context, because how you think about early education really changes from context to context. So the purposes and the goals of early childhood education vary by culture, and these are driven by policy initiatives, demographic shifts, and so on. And we'll be talking more about this throughout the lecture. And second is that the effects of early childhood education must be interpreted within the context of the goals, values, and practices that are established not only by different countries but also by cultures that might exist within a country. So in the United States of America, what works in the Northeast might not work in the South, might not work in the West. I thought you might appreciate looking at this slide. You can see that I've highlighted Chile. This slide comes from Amelia Vegas's work. She's a former student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She now works at the World Bank. And this shows enrollment figures in early childhood education in Latin America from birth through age 6. And I think one of the things that you can see is that relative to other Latin American countries, Chile does very well with respect to enrollment. This slide shows the investment that Chile makes relative to other Latin American cultures. And here I think you can see as well that Chile invests in early childhood education to a high degree relative to other countries in Latin America. It invests 0.4% of its gross national product, which is really quite a lot. However, if you look at OECD countries, so these are mostly countries in Europe and, of course, the United States, they invest considerably more in early childhood education. And I think it's fair to say that even in OECD countries, there is a problem with respect to early childhood education. So when I talk in the United States about what's wrong with our country, this is what I say. Our system is fragmented, and by that I mean early childhood education is delivered by many, many different groups. We have for-profit child care centers. We have nonprofit child care centers. We have programs, government-sponsored programs like Head Start, which are for children living in poverty. We have some preschool that's delivered through the government, but those are in fact a minority. So much, I sometimes call it a patchwork quilt. I don't know if that metaphor makes sense here, but you're trying to make these things together and have them be a beautiful quilt, and sometimes I think the quilt has ragged edges. So the second point is about access. Early childhood education for middle class and affluent children tends to work reasonably well. But for lower middle class children and for children in poverty, not necessarily so well. And the reason is that it's very expensive in the United States. I want to give you a figure in US dollars that I hope is meaningful to you. But Harvard University has 5 or 6 wonderful child care centers from birth through age 4. And they're somewhat subsidized by Harvard. And even with the Harvard subsidy, it's about $2,000 per month per child in infant and toddler care. So even assistant professors would struggle to pay for that kind of high quality care. And what this means is that access to quality care is severely limited. So we have a situation where I think it actually exacerbates a kind of achievement gap between rich children and poor children. The third point I'm making is really related. Equity is limited. There really is no equity. At least when you talk about public education, I think there are equity issues there too, from kindergarten through 12th grade in my country, because schools are supported by local communities. So if you are born into a rich community, the public school is better than if you're born into a poor community on average. But the equity situation with early childhood education, I think, is much more serious. Again, this is primarily due to cost, and then the limited training that we have in general, again in my country, for early education. So I've titled this slide Universal Challenges. They certainly apply to the United States of America and to other industrialized countries, but they also apply to other countries throughout the world. Okay, so now the next part of the talk, the middle part of my talk, is really the heart of it. Why should we invest in young children? Why there as opposed to any other time during the life cycle? And I'm going to try to make an argument that investing in early education before the age of 5 is maybe the smartest thing that any country can do. And the first reason has to do with brain development. And I'm not going to say too much about the neuroscience, but I do want to help explain sort of in common language and common usage why it is that early brain development needs to be supported. So this is a quote from a book that I bet many of the teachers are familiar with. It's called From Neurons to Neighborhood, and this book was produced by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. So I'm going to read this quote in English. It is here for you in Spanish. By ensuring that early environments are more positive and more equitably distributed, we increase the chance of success all children have. By ignoring early inequality, we risk permanently altering the chances some children have at success. These early differences in environments are etched into the structure of our brains. The way we think, react, and feel in adulthood is necessarily related to environmental exposures we did and did not experience in our childhood. So what do we mean by this? Well, in the first 5 years of life, the brain is developing exponentially. And what is happening that we need to care about as educators is that there is a development of network of synapses. And, you know, the synapses are what make the nerve cells communicate with one another. There are networks that develop that are just crucial for the rest of your life. Now, we know about this from animal studies, but we know about this, too, from studies of humans that have been living in deprived environments. For example, children living in orphanages in Romania. There have been a number of studies done of these children. So we know, but mostly from animal studies, we know how important early brain development is. So I'm just going to show you a picture that exemplifies this. I mean, this is a pattern of what we call synaptogenesis of the human cerebral cortex. And what we have, this is at birth. I mean, this is what synapses look like. This is at 6 years, and you can see there's many, many more synapses. Again, these are the connections between nerve cells. And then at 14 years, we see a kind of pruning. We actually see fewer synaptic transmissions at 14 years than we do at 6 years. And no one's sure exactly what's happening in early brain development, but we know that there's a proliferation of synapses, and that through experience, children and young adults develop neural networks in their brains that are responsible for learning. So the fact that these neural networks are reduced through experience is normal. But when children don't have adequate environments, what happens is that they are reduced even more than this. So there's an expression that neuroscientists use called use it or lose it, right? You need to use these synaptic transmissions or you will eventually lose them. So this kind of pruning is a double-edged sword. I mean, we see it and it's normal, but again, it's very important that during the first 5-6 years of life that we are laying down the kind of brain architecture that sets the stage for future learning. Okay, this is a metaphor that my colleague Jack Shonkoff uses, kind of brain architecture that sets the stage for learning. So again, this slide is also from Neurons to Neighborhoods, and this shows you how, basically it's a depiction of how children's brains are built up over time. So you see the first part of the x-axis shows before birth, right, prenatally. Of course, the brain is developing. And then this pink area that you're going to see in a minute, I'm going to do it for language. And there we go. For higher cognitive functioning, you see how much is happening really in just the first year of life with respect to children's brains development. So again, we can think about it, they're built from the bottom up. And within the context of this overproduction of synapses that I talked about a minute ago, different brain regions with different functions appear to develop on different time courses, right? So first comes the ability to perceive the environment, vision, hearing, and so on. And then we see the brain paying a terrific amount of attention to language development. And then later on, higher cognitive functioning. By this I mean things like the ability to plan, the ability to organize, the ability to think deductively, and so on. So the point is, if you can see how much is just happening in the first year of life, you know how important it is to help young children learn and, again, to provide a kind of foundation. So let me say more about what I know as early education. Here we see how important this first year of life is. Early education as a foundation for later learning. I mean, this is really what I have spent my life as a developmental psychologist studying, just why these first 5 years of life are so important. I'm going to begin with a quote from James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate economist. I understand he has spoken here in Chile before to the Ministry of Education. I love this quote. I wish I had written it myself. Skill begets skill, motivation begets motivation, motivation cross fosters skill, and skill cross fosters motivation. If a child is not motivated to learn and engage early on in life, the more likely it is that when the child becomes an adult, he or she will fail in social and economic life. And one of the things I like about this quote is that when we are nurturing young children, we're not just nurturing cognitive development. We are trying to give them a sense of efficacy, a sense of self-esteem that they can learn. And so I think one of the more recent discoveries in developmental psychology that even economists write about is just this interconnection between cognitive development and social development. And this interconnection needs to be developed and nurtured during the early childhood years. So I'm going to tell you now about a couple of studies, including, I'll end with my own research, that demonstrate this. And again, some of the studies might be familiar to you, especially those of you who've studied child development. The first study I want to just tell you a little about is Arthur Reynolds' work in Chicago, where they had parent-child centers, okay? So early education that involved some parent education, but mostly places for children to be. And they were able to do longitudinal studies of these children to see how they performed. So children who did not receive a strong education from pre-kindergarten through 3rd grade, these are the early years, were 3 times more likely to be held back